We split up to cover more ground. Only one of us came back to camp. Frost crunched beneath Mason Edwards's boots as he stirred the campfire to life, his breath clouding in the pre-dawn Montana air. At 52, the former forest ranger's weathered face had recorded decades of these hunting trips, each wrinkle a testament to years spent reading the wilderness like others read books. Nearby, his brother Ethan grunted as he hefted their food cache into a tree, standard procedure in bear country. At 48, Ethan's construction-hardened muscles made the task look effortless, though Mason noted the slight grimace that betrayed his brother's arthritic shoulder. "Coffee's almost ready," Mason called, just as their third companion emerged from his tent. Trevor Wilson, Mason's son-in-law of 5 years, zipped his jacket against the chill. The emergency room doctor's precise movements reflected his clinical background, but his eyes held the eager uncertainty of a man still finding his place in this tradition. "Sleep okay?" Mason asked, passing him a steaming cup. "Better than the hospital on-call room," Trevor replied with a smile that didn't quite mask his nervousness. Their campsite nestled in a small clearing in the Bitterroot National Forest. 3 tents arranged around the fire pit like numbers on a clock face. Dense pines surrounded them, and beyond, the mountains rose sharp against the lightening sky. They had packed in enough supplies for 7 days, though they planned to be out for just 5. Mason's cautious nature showing through in the extra provisions. As sunlight filtered through the trees, they spread their topographical map across a flat rock, shoulders touching as they hunched over it. "Weather report says clear for the next 3 days, then snow moving in," Mason said, studying his satellite phone. "We should make the most of today." Ethan traced a gnarled finger along a ridgeline. "I spotted fresh tracks in the north drainage yesterday." "That's a lot of ground to cover," Trevor observed, studying the contour lines. Then hesitantly, "What if we split up? We could cover 3 different areas, meet back by sunset." Mason frowned. He preferred hunting as a group, especially with Trevor still learning the terrain. But the elk were scattered this year, and the strategy made sense. "All right," he finally agreed, "but we stick to the plan. Everyone back at camp no later than sunset. Radios on, check in every 2 hours." They divided the map into 3 sectors. Mason would take the north drainage with the fresh tracks. Ethan would head east toward a high meadow that had proven productive in previous years. Trevor would explore the western ridge, gentler terrain that Mason judged manageable for his less experienced son-in-law. "Remember, we're after meat for the freezer, not trophies," Mason reminded them as they gathered their gear. "Don't pass up a decent shot waiting for some mythical 6-point bull." Each man checked his rifle, ammunition, and emergency supplies. Mason noticed Trevor triple-checking his first aid kit, doctor's habits dying hard. "See you boys at sunset," Ethan said, adjusting his blaze-orange cap. "And don't shoot anything too big. I'm not hauling your elk out for you." With that final jest, they separated, each disappearing into the forest in different directions. The morning air was cold enough to see their breath, but the sun promised to warm the day as it climbed higher. None of them could have predicted that only 2 would return to camp that evening. Trevor moved through the western forest with deliberate caution, each footfall placed to minimize sound. 2 hours into his hunt, his thighs burned from the uphill climb, but he welcomed the sensation, a reminder that he was alive, away from the antiseptic hospital corridors where he spent most days. The forest here was less dense than he'd expected, with occasional rock outcroppings that offered good vantage points. He had seen plenty of sign, droppings, rubs on trees where bulls had scraped velvet from their antlers, even a few tracks, but no elk. His radio crackled. "Check-in time," came Mason's voice, slightly distorted by static. "North drainage, nothing but old sign. Over." "East meadow here," Ethan responded. "Jumped a cow about 20 minutes ago, but no shot. Moving higher up. Over." Trevor unclipped his radio. "Western ridge. Lots of sign, but no animals yet. Weather's holding nice. Over." As he continued, Trevor's mind wandered to Elise, his wife, back home in Missoula. They had been talking about starting a family soon, discussions that always left him with a mixture of excitement and terror. Not unlike hunting, he mused, anticipation mixed with primal fear. Around noon, he found a flat rock with a good view and unwrapped a sandwich. As he ate, he scanned the terrain with his binoculars. The landscape fell away below him, revealing a small valley he hadn't expected. According to his map, there should be a seasonal creek at the bottom, though it might be dry this time of year. The valley looked promising, sheltered with mixed vegetation that would provide both food and cover for elk. Trevor decided to investigate, even though it meant deviating from his assigned sector. He was confident he could explore the valley and still make it back to camp by sunset. Descending proved more treacherous than anticipated. What had looked like a gentle slope from above turned out to be steeper, with loose shale that shifted underfoot. Twice he slid several feet before catching himself on saplings. Once a rock dislodged by his boot tumbled down, gathering momentum until it crashed into a deadfall with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire valley. Trevor froze, mentally cursing. Any game within half a mile would be alerted now. By the time he reached the valley floor, his watch showed just after 1 o'clock. With the start, he realized he had missed the scheduled radio check-in. He reached for his radio, but before he could call in, movement at the edge of his vision froze him in place. Through a gap in the trees, he spotted the tawny hide of an elk. Not just any elk, a magnificent bull, its massive antlers silhouetted against the foliage. It was over 200 yards away, moving slowly through a small clearing, unaware of Trevor's presence. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was exactly what they had come for, a chance at a trophy bull that would provide hundreds of pounds of meat and a story to tell for years. Forgetting the radio check-in, he slowly raised his binoculars. The bull was even more impressive than he'd first thought, a 6-point, maybe more, with a heavy rack and thick neck. A monarch of the forest. With careful movements, Trevor unslung his rifle and found a fallen log to use as a rest. He settled into position, controlling his breathing as Mason had taught him. The bull was quartering away, a good angle for a clean shot that would damage minimal meat. Trevor flicked off the safety, took one more deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report shattered the valley's silence, echoing off the surrounding slopes. The bull dropped immediately, its front legs buckling before its hindquarters followed. A perfect shot through the vitals, the kind hunters dream about. Trevor stood exhilarated and slightly stunned at his success. He had done it, taken a trophy bull on his first real elk hunt. He waited, rifle ready, watching for any movement that might indicate the animal was only wounded. Nothing. The massive creature lay motionless. His radio crackled urgently. "Trevor, this is Mason. Missed your check-in. Everything okay? Over." Trevor fumbled for his radio, still watching the downed elk. "Sorry about that. Got a little distracted. Just took down a bull. A big one. Over." There was a pause before Mason's voice returned, tinged with both concern and pride. "Good work. Where are you? Over." Trevor looked around, suddenly realizing his predicament. He had descended into a valley that wasn't part of his assigned area, and he now had several hundred pounds of elk to field dress and somehow get back to camp. "I'm in a small valley west of the ridge. Followed some sign down here. It's off my route, but I should make it back by sunset. Over." "Need help with the field dressing?" "Over." This was Ethan's voice now. "No, I've got it," Trevor replied, remembering Mason's instructions. "But I won't be able to pack out much meat today. Maybe just the backstraps and tenderloins. We can come back for the rest tomorrow. Over." "Roger that," Mason said. "Just be careful and make sure you're on your way back with plenty of daylight left. Weather's still good, but don't take chances. Over and out." Trevor approached his elk with reverence, mixed with pragmatism. Field dressing was a messy, physically demanding job. He'd assisted Mason with a deer last year, but doing it alone was another matter entirely. He removed his pack and took out his knife, paracord, and game bags. He donned latex gloves, a physician's habit, and set to work. The first incision released a wave of metallic-smelling warmth, and he had to steel himself against his doctor's instinct to heal rather than harvest. Time blurred as Trevor worked. The field dressing proved more challenging than anticipated. The bull's size made simply rolling it to access both sides nearly impossible, and twice Trevor had to stop to sharpen his knife on a small whetstone. Blood soaked through his gloves, making the knife handle slippery, and once it slid across his palm, leaving a shallow cut that stung fiercely. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cool air. Muscles in his back protested from the constant bending and lifting. But a sense of ancient accomplishment drove him forward. This was what humans had done for millennia to feed their families. When Trevor finally straightened up and checked his watch, alarm shot through him. It was already past 4 o'clock. Sunset would be around 6:30, giving him barely 2 hours to find his way back to camp. He looked up at the steep slope he had descended earlier, then at his now heavier pack containing the choicest cuts of meat. The climb would be challenging, especially after the exertion of field dressing the animal. He secured the remainder of the carcass as best he could, hanging game bags from tree branches to keep predators from reaching them easily. He would have to return tomorrow with Mason and Ethan for the rest. "One step at a time," he muttered, shouldering his pack and rifle. He took a final look at the location, making mental notes of landmarks so they could return. Then he began the ascent, unaware that the northern sky behind him had begun to darken with approaching clouds. The first flakes of snow would begin falling within the hour. The climb proved even more difficult than Trevor had feared. The added weight of the meat made his balance precarious on the loose rocks and soil of the slope. Halfway up, he had to stop, his breath coming in gasps, sweat soaking his shirt despite the rapidly cooling air. "Mason, Ethan, this is Trevor. I've got the meat packed up and I'm heading back, but it's slow going. Might be cutting it close to sunset. Over." Static answered him. Trevor frowned and tried again, adjusting the volume and channel settings. Still nothing but static. He was in a low spot surrounded by terrain that could easily block the signal. Once he reached the ridge again, communication should improve. The first snowflakes began to fall as he resumed climbing. Small at first, just delicate crystals that melted on contact, but growing steadily more numerous. Trevor glanced at the darkening sky with increasing concern. By the time he reached the ridge, the light was failing and his legs trembled with fatigue. He tried the radio again. "Mason, Ethan, do you copy? Over." This time, a faint response came through, broken by static. "Ver, this is Mason. Where? You? Signals. Bad. Over." "I'm back on the ridge, headed east toward camp now. Should make it before dark, but it'll be close. Over." More static then. "Weather, changing, cloud, moving in, north. Try to back sooner. Over." The snow intensified, driven by a wind that had shifted to the north. Visibility diminished rapidly as twilight deepened into dusk. Trevor checked his compass frequently, making sure he maintained an easterly heading that should lead him back to camp. But as darkness fell, he began to worry. The landmarks didn't look familiar. Had he drifted too far south when descending into the valley? The first serious misstep came as he crossed a patch of snow-covered ground. His right foot landed on a hidden root, twisting violently. Pain shot up his leg as he fell forward, the momentum carrying him down a short but steep embankment. He landed hard, felt a sharp pain in his ankle, and heard worse, the crack of his rifle stock breaking against a rock. For a moment he lay still, assessing the damage. His ankle throbbed but didn't seem broken, probably a sprain. The rifle, however, was another matter. The wooden stock had split nearly in two, rendering the weapon useless. Trevor sat up slowly, brushing snow from his clothes. The fall had knocked the wind out of him, and as he caught his breath, a new sound reached his ears, the low, rumbling growl of a large predator. He turned slowly toward the sound. His headlamp illuminated a pair of reflective eyes about 40 yards away, the unmistakable form of a mountain lion crouched on a fallen log. Fear flooded Trevor's system, but the clinical part of his doctor's mind remained detached, analyzing. Mountain lion attacks on adults were rare, but not unheard of, especially if the animal was hungry or felt threatened. With his rifle broken and his body already fatigued, Trevor knew he was in serious trouble. Moving as smoothly as possible, he reached for his pack and unzipped an outer pocket where he kept his hunting knife and bear spray. The mountain lion watched, tail twitching, neither advancing nor retreating. Trevor slowly got to his feet, wincing as his injured ankle protested. He raised his arms, trying to appear larger. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing strangely in the snow-muffled forest. "Get out of here!" The mountain lion flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, a precursor to an attack. With his heart hammering, Trevor prepared the bear spray, removing the safety clip with his thumb. When the big cat launched itself forward, it moved with astonishing speed. Trevor had just enough time to aim the canister and depress the trigger. The spray shot out in a cone, some of it catching the animal mid-leap. The mountain lion veered off, yowling in pain and confusion, crashing through underbrush as it fled. Trevor stood frozen, bear spray still extended, ears straining for any sound of the predator's return. The immediate danger had passed, but his situation remained dire. Night had fallen completely, the snowstorm was intensifying, and he was injured, lost, and still far from camp. Back at camp, Mason paced anxiously around the fire pit, periodically checking his watch and the darkening sky. Ethan sat nearby, methodically cleaning his rifle, though his frequent glances toward the forest betrayed his concern. He should have been back by now, Mason said, not for the first time. The storm's moving in faster than predicted. Ethan set his rifle aside. Maybe he got turned around in the snow. You know how it is. Everything looks different once it's covered in white. Mason nodded grimly. He knew all too well how easily experienced hunters could become disoriented in a snowstorm, let alone someone with Trevor's limited backcountry experience. 23 years as a forest ranger had shown him how quickly wilderness situations could deteriorate. "We need to try the radio again, then decide on a plan." He raised the radio to his lips. "Trevor, this is Mason. Do you copy? Over." The response was nothing but static. Mason tried twice more before giving up. "I don't like this," Ethan said, standing to join his brother. "That snowstorm's serious business, and if he's still out there with night falling..." Mason made a decision. "We'll give him 30 more minutes. If he's not back by then, we start searching. I've got flares in my pack. We can fire one every 15 minutes. Might help him find his way to camp if he's close." The brothers used the time to prepare. They inventoried their emergency gear, headlamps with extra batteries, first aid supplies, space blankets, fire starters, extra food and water. Mason pulled out his topographical map and spread it on a dry tarp under their camp's rainfly, protected from the increasing snowfall. He said he was in a valley west of the ridge, Mason recalled, tracing the contour lines with a weathered finger. That narrows it down, but it's still a lot of ground to cover in these conditions. Ethan pointed to a steep-sided depression on the map. "Could be this one. I've hunted there before. Lots of cover, good elk habitat." Mason nodded. "We'll start there. If we don't find him, we'll work our way along the ridge." When 30 minutes had passed with no sign of Trevor, they shouldered their packs and checked their headlamps. The snow was falling heavily now, accumulating rapidly on the ground and bending the branches of smaller trees with its weight. "I'll take point," Mason said, his ranger training asserting itself. "You follow 10 yards back. That way we'll cover more ground with our lights, but still keep each other in sight." Before leaving camp, Mason fired the first flare. It shot into the sky with a hiss, bursting into bright red light that illuminated the snowscape for miles around. They waited, listening for any response, but heard nothing except the soft patter of snowflakes and the occasional groan of tree limbs under their growing burden. The brothers moved out, their headlamps cutting twin cones of visibility through the swirling white. Every 100 yards, Mason would stop and call Trevor's name, the sound deadened by the falling snow. Ethan would echo the call, both men then pausing to listen for a response that never came. Progress was painfully slow. The fresh snow obscured landmarks, making navigation challenging even for Mason's experienced eye. Twice they had to consult the map and compass to confirm their heading. An hour into their search, they reached the edge of the valley they believed Trevor might have entered. Mason fired another flare, its red glow reflecting off the snow-covered landscape. "Look," Ethan said suddenly, pointing to a disturbance in the snow near the valley rim. "Tracks." Mason knelt to examine them. They were rapidly filling with fresh snow, but the pattern was still visible, the imprint of boot treads identical to Trevor's hunting boots. The tracks led down into the valley. "They're recent," Mason confirmed, "within the last few hours." New urgency energized their movements as they followed the trail down the treacherous slope. Neither man spoke what both were thinking. Trevor might be seriously injured, or worse. With temperatures dropping and the storm intensifying, even a minor injury could prove fatal if it prevented movement and the generation of body heat. At the valley floor, the tracks became harder to follow as the deepening snow obscured them. Mason and Ethan pressed on, scanning the darkness with their lights, calling Trevor's name into the vast, indifferent wilderness. Trevor knew he needed shelter. With the temperature dropping and his clothes damp from exertion and snow, hypothermia was a real risk. Staying put and building a shelter was his best option. Moving through unfamiliar terrain at night, especially with an injured ankle, would only increase his chances of further injury or becoming more hopelessly lost. He scanned the area with his headlamp and spotted a promising location, a small overhang created by a fallen tree leaning against a boulder. It wouldn't provide complete protection from the elements, but it was better than nothing. Working methodically despite his growing exhaustion, Trevor constructed a rudimentary shelter. He propped branches against the fallen tree to create walls, then layered pine boughs inside to insulate himself from the cold ground. From his pack, he retrieved an emergency space blanket, a thin sheet of reflective material designed to conserve body heat. Once the shelter was complete, Trevor crawled inside, arranging his pack as a pillow and wrapping the space blanket around himself. The silver material crinkled as he moved, reflecting his body heat back toward him. It wasn't comfortable, but it would help him survive the night. His ankle throbbed relentlessly. Trevor carefully removed his boot to assess the damage. The joint was swollen and discolored, but he could still move it, albeit painfully. Not broken, just a bad sprain. He folded his spare sock into a compression pad and reapplied his boot loosely to provide some support without cutting off circulation. The cold seeped through his makeshift shelter despite his efforts. Trevor's teeth began to chatter, his body's attempt to generate heat through muscle movement. He knew the dangers of hypothermia all too well. First came shivering, then confusion and poor decision-making, followed by lethargy, and eventually, if unchecked, death. To combat the cold, Trevor began a series of isometric exercises, tensing and releasing muscle groups to generate heat without moving his injured ankle. He also forced himself to eat a protein bar and some jerky from his pack, knowing his body needed fuel to maintain its core temperature. As the night wore on, exhaustion battled with survival instinct. Trevor fought to stay awake, knowing that sleep could be dangerous in his condition. To keep his mind active, he recited medical mnemonics from his training, listed the bones of the human body in order, even sang songs under his breath. Sometime in the darkest hours of the night, Trevor thought he heard a distant pop and saw a faint red glow through the falling snow. A flare? Could Mason and Ethan be searching for him already? He fumbled for his whistle, blowing 3 sharp blasts, the universal distress signal. But the sound seemed swallowed by the storm, and no answering call came. By dawn, the snow had accumulated to about 8 inches and continued to fall, though less heavily than the previous evening. Trevor's body ached from the cold and the hard ground, and his injured ankle had stiffened overnight, but he was alive and thinking clearly, good signs under the circumstances. He ate another protein bar and drank sparingly from his water bottle. Food and water weren't immediate concerns. He had enough for another day or two if he rationed carefully. His priorities were finding his location and making contact with Mason and Ethan. Trevor carefully repacked his gear and emerged from his shelter. The landscape had transformed overnight, familiar features buried under white. He tested his ankle, painful, but it could bear some weight. Good enough to move, if carefully. His plan was to find high ground where his radio might work. Using his compass, Trevor set out toward what he believed was the east, limping but determined. The going was painfully slow through the snow, each step a negotiation with pain. By mid-morning he had reached a small clearing that offered a view of the surrounding landscape. Miles of forest blanketed in white, with more snow-laden clouds obscuring the higher peaks. Nothing looked familiar. Trevor pulled out his radio. "Mason, Ethan, this is Trevor. Do you copy? Over." To his surprise and relief, a response came almost immediately. "Trevor, thank God. This is Mason. What's your status? Over." "I'm alive, but a bit worse for wear. Sprained ankle, spent the night in a makeshift shelter. I'm lost, not sure of my location. Over." "We're searching for you," Mason replied. "Can you describe any landmarks near you?" Over. Trevor scanned the area again. "I'm in a small clearing on what seems to be the southern slope of a hill. There's a distinctive rock formation to my west. Looks like a fist pointing up from the hillside. Over." "Devil's Knuckle," Mason responded immediately. "We know where you are. Stay put. We're coming." Trevor maintained his fire and continued signaling with his whistle, but as daylight began to fade, doubt crept in. Had they misidentified the landmark? Were they searching in the wrong area? Or had something happened to them as well? As the light drained from the sky and the temperature plummeted again, Trevor prepared to face a second night in the wilderness. His ankle had swollen further despite his efforts to keep it elevated, and the cold had settled deep in his bones, a chill he couldn't seem to shake. He was arranging more branches around his shelter when he heard it, a faint whistle in the distance, answering his own. He blew his whistle again, 3 short blasts. The response came more clearly this time, and with it, a distant shout. "Trevor, can you hear us?" "Here!" Trevor shouted back, struggling to his feet despite the pain. "I'm over here." Minutes later, Mason and Ethan emerged from the trees at the edge of the clearing, their forms blurred by the falling snow. The sight of them, exhausted, covered in snow, but very much real, was the most welcome thing Trevor had ever seen. Mason quickly assessed Trevor's condition, while Ethan added wood to the fire. "You're lucky," Mason said, examining the ankle. "Doesn't look like frostbite has set in, and the sprain isn't as bad as it could be, but we need to get you back to camp." "Can you walk?" Ethan asked, handing Trevor a thermos of hot coffee from his pack. Trevor nodded, taking a grateful sip of the scalding liquid. "Slowly, but yes." "Good," Mason said, "because we've got a decision to make. The storm's supposed to worsen overnight. We can either try to make it back to camp tonight, it's about 3 miles from here, or we can set up a proper shelter here and head back in the morning." Trevor considered the options. Night was falling, his ankle was painful, and the journey would be challenging, but the prospect of a warm tent and proper food at camp was tempting. "Let's try for camp," he said finally. "I can make it." With Ethan and Mason supporting him, Trevor began the difficult journey back to camp. The going was slow and painful, but the presence of his companions gave him strength he didn't know he had. They moved through the snowy forest as twilight deepened into night, guided by headlamps and Mason's unerring sense of direction. Halfway back, the storm intensified, wind driving snow horizontally through the trees, vision reduced to just a few feet ahead, and the cold bit through their clothing with renewed ferocity. "We need to keep moving," Mason shouted over the wind. "Stopping now would be dangerous." They pressed on, one painful step after another. Trevor's ankle screamed with each footfall, but he gritted his teeth and continued. When his strength began to flag, Ethan wordlessly took more of his weight, the brothers working in tandem to keep him moving. It was well past midnight when they finally saw the welcome glow of their camp through the trees. Trevor was nearly delirious with exhaustion and pain by then, barely able to put one foot in front of the other. But they had made it. All 3 of them had made it back. As Mason helped Trevor into his tent and Ethan rekindled the camp's fire, Trevor reflected on the past 36 hours. He had achieved his goal of taking a trophy bull. But the experience had taught him something far more valuable: respect for the wilderness and its unpredictable nature, and gratitude for companions who would risk their own safety to find a lost member of their party. "That bull," Trevor murmured as Mason helped him into his sleeping bag. "We'll never get the meat out now. It's a waste." Mason shook his head. "The meat's not wasted. It'll feed the forest, the mountain lions, bears, wolves, and smaller creatures. Nothing's wasted in nature." He patted Trevor's shoulder. "Get some rest. We'll start for the trailhead tomorrow, if the weather breaks." As Trevor drifted toward sleep, he thought about the story they would tell when they returned home. A story not just about hunting, but about survival, brotherhood, and the thin line between life and death in the wilderness. One thing was certain: they would never again split up to cover more ground. Some lessons were worth the price they exacted. The next morning, as the three men broke camp under clearing skies, a single raven circled overhead, its harsh call echoing through the trees. Below, in the valley where Trevor had left his elk, a mountain lion, perhaps the same one he had encountered, fed on the abandoned carcass, the natural cycle of the wilderness continuing uninterrupted by the brief intrusion of the hunters who had come and gone.